A legendary crooner lived his final years haunted by the loss of his beloved son in a military plane crash, slowly retreating from the world that once adored him. But 21 years after his death on Christmas Day, 1995, his former wife Jane would make a heartbreaking discovery in her final weeks, one that would reveal the devastating truth about how grief had consumed the Martin family for decades. The name Dean Martin once represented everything glamorous about Hollywood's golden age. With his smooth voice, effortless charm, and magnetic presence alongside Frank Sinatra in the legendary Rat Pack, he seemed to have it all. But beneath the surface of champagne toasts and sold-out shows, a darkness was growing that would eventually destroy everything he held dear. On March 21, 1987, Dean Paul Martin Jr., the multi-talented son of the entertainment icon, climbed into the cockpit of an F-4C Phantom jet for what should have been a routine training mission over the San Bernardino Mountains. The 35-year-old captain had conquered nearly every field he touched: music, acting, professional tennis, and military aviation. He was the golden child, the one who seemed destined for greatness. But as snowstorms engulfed the mountains that morning, something went terribly wrong. The jet carrying Dean Paul and his weapons officer Captain Ramon Ortiz vanished from radar screens, leaving behind only silence and the desperate search efforts that would follow. When rescue teams finally located the wreckage 3 days later, they found the aircraft had slammed into a granite wall at over 400 miles per hour, pulverizing both men instantly. For Dean Martin, the loss of his eldest son marked the beginning of the end. Friends would later say he never recovered from that devastating phone call. The man who had once made the world laugh and swoon with his music became a shadow of himself, retreating into isolation as his health deteriorated and his spirit withered away. But the Martin family's tragic tale was far from over. In 2016, 21 years after Dean's death, another devastating blow would strike. Jean Martin, Dean's former wife and the mother of his 3 children, would face her own battle with cancer, while simultaneously dealing with the mysterious death of their youngest son Richie, found dead in his Utah home at age 62. In her final weeks, as cancer ravaged her 89-year-old body, Jean would reflect on the pattern of loss that had defined their family. Despite their divorce in 1973, she had remained connected to Dean's memory and their shared grief over Dean Paul's death. Her passing just 3 weeks after Ricky's death would complete a circle of tragedy that had begun with that fateful training flight 30 years earlier. This is the true account of how one family's American dream transformed into an American nightmare, where fame and fortune proved powerless against the relentless march of heartbreak and loss. In 1949, when Dean Martin married Dorothy Jane Bieger, the future seemed limitless. Dean was already making waves in Hollywood, having formed his legendary partnership with Jerry Lewis just 3 years earlier. Jean, a stunning former model and Orange Bowl queen from Coral Gables, Florida, represented everything a rising star could want in a wife: beauty, grace, and the kind of wholesome American appeal that would photograph beautifully in the fan magazines. Their wedding was a fairy tale affair that captured the imagination of post-war America. Dean, born Dino Paul Crocetti in Steubenville, Ohio, had already reinvented himself once, transforming from a small-town Italian-American kid into a smooth-talking entertainer. Now, with Jean by his side, he was ready to conquer the world. The couple settled into married life with all the glamour that Hollywood could offer. Dean's career was exploding in multiple directions. His comedy partnership with Jerry Lewis was generating millions at the box office. His recording career was taking off, and his natural charisma was making him a favorite with audiences across the country. Jean, meanwhile, gracefully transitioned from model to Hollywood wife, attending premieres and industry events with the kind of poise that made her a favorite with photographers and gossip columnists. Their first child together, Dean Paul Martin Jr., was born on November 17, 1951. From the moment he arrived, it was clear that young Dean, as he was affectionately called, had inherited the best of both parents. He had his father's dark good looks and natural charm, combined with his mother's grace and intelligence. As he grew, it became apparent that he was gifted with an almost supernatural ability to excel at whatever he attempted. 2 more children would follow: Richie James Martin, born in 1953, and Gina Caroline Martin, born in 1956. The Martin household was a picture of domestic bliss, at least from the outside. Dean was earning enormous sums of money, enough to provide his family with a palatial home in Beverly Hills, the finest clothes, the best education, and all the privileges that came with being part of Hollywood royalty. Young Dean Paul quickly became the crown jewel of the family. By age 13, he had already formed a singing group with Desi Arnaz Jr. and Billy Hinchy, called Dino, Desi and Billy. The trio scored several Billboard Top 30 hits, including I'm a Fool, which reached number 17 in 1965. For most teenagers, this would have been the pinnacle of achievement, but for Dean Paul, it was just the beginning. He excelled academically, earning admission to UCLA, where he became an NCAA tennis champion. His athletic prowess was matched by his intellectual capabilities and his natural performing ability. Teachers and coaches alike marveled at his dedication and natural talent. He seemed to approach every challenge with the same methodical determination that had made his father a star. During these golden years, the Martin family appeared to have achieved the American dream in its purest form. Dean's career reached stratospheric heights when he joined Frank Sinatra's Rat Pack, becoming part of the most exclusive and influential entertainment circle in the world. The group's legendary performances in Las Vegas, their movies together, and their well-publicized friendships made them cultural icons. Jean thrived in this environment, becoming a beloved figure in Hollywood social circles. She was known for her intelligence, her wit, and her ability to hold her own in conversations with some of the most powerful people in the entertainment industry. Unlike some Hollywood wives who seemed diminished by their husband's fame, Jean grew more confident and sophisticated with each passing year. The family's Beverly Hills home became a gathering place for Hollywood's elite. Dean's famous friends would drop by regularly, and the house would fill with laughter, music, and the kind of sophisticated conversation that defined the entertainment industry's golden age. The Martin children grew up surrounded by legendary performers, directors, and producers, giving them a unique perspective on the world of show business. Dean Paul, in particular, seemed to absorb everything around him. He was comfortable speaking with adults, possessed a natural stage presence, and demonstrated an intuitive understanding of the entertainment business that impressed even seasoned professionals. Many predicted that he would eventually surpass his father's achievements, perhaps becoming the first true multimedia superstar of his generation. The family's success extended beyond entertainment. Dean's business ventures were thriving, his investments were paying off handsomely, and his real estate holdings were appreciating rapidly. Financial security was never a concern for the Martins, allowing them to focus on their personal relationships and creative pursuits. During family vacations, they would travel to the most exotic locations in the world, staying in the finest hotels and experiencing the best that money could buy. These trips were documented in family photographs that showed a genuinely happy family enjoying their time together. Dean, despite his busy schedule, made sure to spend quality time with his children, teaching them about music, sports, and the importance of hard work. Jean proved to be not just a devoted wife, but also an exceptional mother. She managed the household with remarkable efficiency, ensuring that the children received the best education possible, while maintaining the kind of stable home environment that could easily have been disrupted by the chaos of Hollywood life. She was involved in numerous charitable organizations and used her platform to support causes she believed in. The Martin marriage, during these early years, seemed to be a genuine partnership. Dean and Jean complemented each other perfectly. He provided the star power and creative energy, while she provided the stability and social grace that kept their family grounded. They were frequently photographed together at industry events, and their body language and expressions suggested a couple who were genuinely in love and enjoying their life together. As the 1960s progressed, the Martin family's influence continued to grow. Dean's television variety show became a cultural phenomenon, and his recording career reached new heights. Jean's social connections opened doors for various business opportunities, and the children were developing their own distinct personalities and talents. But even during these golden years, there were subtle signs that all was not as perfect as it appeared. Dean's drinking, which had long been part of his public persona, was becoming more problematic in private. The demands of his career were keeping him away from home for extended periods, and the constant pressure of maintaining their public image was taking its toll on the entire family. Dean Paul, despite his many successes, seemed to be searching for something more meaningful than entertainment industry fame. He was drawn to more serious pursuits, competitive tennis, academic achievement, and eventually, military service. There was a restlessness in him that suggested he was trying to prove himself beyond the shadow of his famous father. The cracks in the Martin marriage were still barely visible, but they were there. Jan was beginning to chafe at the restrictions of being a Hollywood wife, and Dean was becoming increasingly isolated despite being surrounded by people constantly. The very success that had brought them together was beginning to create distance between them. Looking back, it's clear that the Martin family's golden years contained the seeds of the tragedy that would eventually consume them. The pressure of maintaining perfection, the unrealistic expectations placed on every family member, and the fundamental loneliness that often accompanies great fame were all building toward a breaking point that no one could have anticipated. By the late 1960s, the fairy tale facade of the Martin marriage was beginning to show serious strain. Dean's career demands had become increasingly overwhelming, with television commitments, recording sessions, live performances, and movie shoots keeping him away from home for months at a time. When he was home, he was often emotionally distant, retreating into alcohol and the company of his show business friends rather than engaging with his family. Jian, meanwhile, was struggling with the isolation that came with being married to one of the world's most famous entertainers. The constant scrutiny from the media, the pressure to maintain appearances, and the loneliness of raising 3 children essentially as a single parent were taking their toll. She had sacrificed her own career and independence to support Dean's ambitions, and now she was questioning whether that sacrifice had been worth it. The children were also feeling the pressure of their father's fame. Dean Paul, now in his late teens, was trying to establish his own identity while constantly being compared to his legendary father. Every achievement was measured against Dean's success, and every failure was magnified by the public's expectations. The weight of the Martin name was becoming as much a burden as a blessing. In 1969, after 20 years of marriage, Dean and Jean made the difficult decision to separate. The official reason given to the press was the familiar Hollywood euphemism of irreconcilable differences, but those close to the family knew the truth was more complex. Dean's drinking had become a serious problem. His emotional unavailability had created an insurmountable distance between him and Jean, and their different visions for their future had become impossible to reconcile. The separation was handled with the kind of dignity and discretion that had characterized their entire marriage. There were no public accusations, no bitter custody battles, and no salacious details leaked to the tabloids. Both Dean and Jian were committed to protecting their children from the fallout of their failed marriage, and they succeeded in maintaining a civil relationship throughout the process. However, the divorce proceedings dragged on for years, not being finalized until 1973. During this period, both Dean and Jane struggled to rebuild their lives. Dean threw himself even more deeply into his work, while Jane focused on raising their children and trying to find a new sense of purpose. Dean Paul, now in his early 20s, was coming into his own as a performer and athlete. He had married actress Olivia Hussey in 1971, following through on a prediction he had made as a teenager when he saw her in Romeo and Juliet. Their marriage produced a son, Alexander, but the union was troubled from the start. Dean Paul's restless ambition and Olivia's career demands created conflicts that neither of them seemed capable of resolving. During this period, Dean Paul was pursuing multiple careers simultaneously. He was playing professional tennis, competing in tournaments around the world, and even qualifying for Wimbledon. He was also acting, landing roles in films and television shows that showcased his natural charisma and talent. But perhaps most significantly, he was becoming increasingly interested in aviation. Dean Paul had earned his pilot's license at age 16, and flying had become his greatest passion. He spoke eloquently about the freedom and exhilaration he felt in the cockpit, describing the experience as unlike anything else in his life. Friends and family members noticed that he seemed most at peace when he was talking about flying, and his enthusiasm for aviation was infectious. In 1980, Dean Paul made a decision that would ultimately prove fatal. He enlisted in the California Air National Guard, beginning the process of becoming a military pilot. This decision was driven by several factors: his genuine love of flying, his desire to serve his country, and perhaps most importantly, his need to prove himself in a field that had nothing to do with his father's fame. The training was rigorous and demanding. Dean Paul had to master complex aircraft systems, learn to fly in dangerous conditions, and develop the split-second decision-making skills that could mean the difference between life and death. He approached the training with the same methodical determination that had made him successful in every other field he had entered. By 1981, Dean Paul had been commissioned as a second lieutenant in the United States Air Force. He was assigned to fly F-4C Phantom jets, some of the most sophisticated and dangerous aircraft in the military's arsenal. The Phantom was a temperamental machine that demanded respect and absolute concentration from its pilots. It was fast, powerful, and unforgiving of mistakes. Dean Paul's marriage to Olivia Hussey ended in divorce in 1978, but he quickly found love again with Olympic figure skating gold medalist Dorothy Hamill. Their 1982 wedding was a high-profile affair that captured the attention of the entertainment and sports worlds. Dean Paul, wearing his military dress uniform, looked every inch the American hero, while Dorothy brought her own considerable fame and athletic achievement to the union. However, this marriage too would prove to be short-lived. The demands of Dean Paul's military service, combined with Dorothy's skating career and the constant media attention, created pressures that neither of them had anticipated. They divorced in 1984, another casualty of the Martin family's struggle to balance public success with private happiness. Throughout these personal upheavals, Dean Paul continued to excel in his military career. He was promoted to captain and became known among his fellow pilots as someone who took his responsibilities seriously and approached flying with the kind of professionalism that made him a respected member of his unit. His commanders noted his dedication and his natural ability to handle complex aircraft, but there were also warning signs that those closest to him were beginning to notice. Dean Paul's passion for flying bordered on obsession. He would spend hours discussing aircraft specifications, flight techniques, and the various missions he had flown. He seemed to find in aviation the kind of pure challenge and achievement that had eluded him in his other careers. Dean Martin, watching his son's military career from a distance, was reportedly both proud and concerned. He admired Dean Paul's dedication and service, but he also worried about the inherent dangers of military aviation. The F-4C Phantom was a notoriously difficult aircraft to fly, with a reputation for being unforgiving of pilot error. Several high-profile crashes had already claimed the lives of experienced pilots, and Dean Martin's paternal instincts told him that his son was courting danger. Jean Martin shared these concerns. Despite her divorce from Dean, she remained deeply involved in her children's lives, and was particularly close to Dean Paul. She had watched him struggle to find his place in the world, and while she was proud of his military service, she also worried about the psychological pressures he was placing on himself. The Martin family's concerns were not unfounded. Military aviation in the 1980s was inherently dangerous, with training accidents claiming lives regularly. The F-4C Phantom, while an effective fighter aircraft, was also known for its demanding flight characteristics. Pilots had to maintain constant vigilance, as the aircraft could become uncontrollable in a matter of seconds if not handled properly. Dean Paul's fellow pilots later described him as competent and careful, but also noted that he seemed to push himself harder than necessary. He volunteered for challenging missions and seemed to thrive on the adrenaline rush that came with dangerous flying. Some wondered if he was trying to prove something, perhaps to himself, perhaps to his famous father, or perhaps to the world that had always seen him as just another celebrity child. As 1987 began, Dean Paul was at the height of his military career. He was a respected captain, a skilled pilot, and a valuable member of his unit. He had also resumed his acting career, appearing in the television series Misfits of Science and working on a pilot for another show called A Single Man. It seemed as though he had finally found the balance between his various interests and talents. But the pressures of maintaining multiple careers were taking their toll. Dean Paul was constantly traveling between his military duties and his entertainment industry commitments. He was also dealing with the ongoing stress of his failed marriages and the constant scrutiny that came with being Dean Martin's son. On the morning of March 21, 1987, Dean Paul Martin Jr. climbed into the cockpit of his F-4C Phantom jet for what was supposed to be a routine training mission. The weather forecast called for possible snow in the mountains, but conditions were considered manageable for experienced pilots. Dean Paul and his weapons officer, Captain Ramon Ortiz, had flown together before and were comfortable with each other's abilities. Neither man could have known that they were about to become part of a tragedy that would destroy what remained of the Martin family's happiness and set in motion a chain of events that would claim more lives in the years to come. The morning of March 21, 1987, began like any other training day at March Air Force Base in Riverside, California. Captain Dean Paul Martin Jr. arrived early, as was his habit, to review the mission parameters and conduct his pre-flight checks. The 35-year-old pilot had flown this type of training mission dozens of times before, but he never allowed routine to breed complacency. The mission was straightforward, a practice bombing run over the San Bernardino Mountains using inert ordnance. Dean Paul would be flying with Captain Ramon Ortiz, a 39-year-old weapons officer from Las Vegas who had flown with him on several previous occasions. The two men had developed a good working relationship and trusted each other's professional judgment. Weather conditions were marginal, but within acceptable parameters for the mission. The forecast called for scattered clouds and possible snow in the higher elevations, but visibility was expected to remain adequate for the flight. Both pilots had flown in similar conditions before, and neither saw any reason to cancel or postpone the mission. At precisely 1:35 in the afternoon, Dean Paul's F-4C Phantom jet, tail number 640923, lifted off from March Air Force Base. The aircraft was a veteran of the Vietnam War, manufactured by McDonnell Douglas in 1963, but it had been meticulously maintained and was considered airworthy by all standards. The takeoff was routine, with Dean Paul executing what was known as a maximum climb departure to gain altitude quickly and avoid the scattered cloud cover that was building over the base. Air traffic controllers at March Air Force Base watched the aircraft climb steadily, disappearing into the clouds at approximately 4,700 feet. For the first 9 minutes of the flight, everything proceeded normally. Dean Paul maintained radio contact with air traffic control, reporting his position and altitude as required. The aircraft's radar signature was clear and strong, indicating that all systems were functioning properly. But as the F-4C Phantom entered the more mountainous terrain of the San Bernardino range, conditions began to deteriorate rapidly. What had been scattered clouds at takeoff had developed into a fierce snowstorm, with visibility dropping to near zero in a matter of minutes. The combination of high altitude, rapidly changing weather conditions, and the demanding nature of the maximum climb maneuver created a perfect storm of factors that would challenge even the most experienced pilot. At 1:44 in the afternoon, just 9 minutes after takeoff, Dean Paul's aircraft disappeared from radar screens. The last transmission from the aircraft was a routine position report, with no indication of distress or mechanical problems. One moment the jet was there, the next it was gone, leaving only an ominous silence on the radio frequencies. Air traffic controllers immediately began attempts to re-establish contact with the aircraft. They called repeatedly on all assigned frequencies, hoping to hear Dean Paul's voice responding with his call sign. But the radio remained silent, and the radar screen showed no trace of the F-4C Phantom that had vanished into the storm. Emergency procedures were activated immediately. Search and rescue teams were alerted, and other aircraft in the area were directed to begin looking for any sign of the missing jet. The initial search focused on the planned flight path, but the deteriorating weather conditions made visual searches extremely difficult. As hours passed without any sign of the aircraft, the worst fears of the search teams began to be realized. The F-4C Phantom was a large, sophisticated aircraft with multiple radio systems and emergency beacons. The fact that there had been no distress calls, no emergency radio transmissions, and no signals from the aircraft's survival equipment suggested that something catastrophic had occurred. Dean Martin received the phone call that every parent dreads at his Beverly Hills home. The voice on the other end was calm and professional, but the words were devastating. His son's aircraft was missing and presumed crashed. The search was continuing, but hope was fading with each passing hour. For 3 agonizing days, search teams scoured the rugged terrain of the San Bernardino Mountains. Helicopters braved dangerous weather conditions to search narrow canyons and remote peaks. Ground teams hiked through snow-covered wilderness areas, looking for any sign of the missing aircraft. The entire search operation was hampered by the same weather conditions that had likely contributed to the crash. Jean Martin, despite her divorce from Dean, remained close to her children and was devastated by the news. She joined Dean at the family's Beverly Hills home, where they waited together for word from the search teams. The irony of their reunion under such tragic circumstances was not lost on either of them. The couple who had grown apart in success were now brought together by disaster. On March 24th, 3 days after the aircraft had vanished, searchers finally located the crash site. The F-4C Phantom had slammed into a granite wall on Mount San Gorgonio at an estimated speed of 560 miles per hour. The impact had been so violent that the aircraft was literally pulverized, with debris scattered across a relatively small area. The crash site painted a clear picture of what had happened in the aircraft's final moments. Dean Paul had been flying in severe weather conditions, with visibility reduced to zero by the snowstorm. The combination of spatial disorientation, the demanding nature of the maximum climb maneuver, and the unforgiving terrain had created a situation from which there was no recovery. Investigation teams later determined that Dean Paul had likely become disoriented in the storm and inadvertently flew the aircraft into the mountain while inverted. The granite wall that claimed their lives was located between 2 mountain peaks at an altitude of 3,750 feet. The aircraft had been flying at maximum power when it impacted, suggesting that Dean Paul was attempting to climb out of the dangerous terrain when the crash occurred. Captain Ramon Ortiz, who had been in the rear seat of the aircraft as the weapons officer, died instantly alongside Dean Paul. Both men were dedicated military professionals who had been serving their country when tragedy struck. Their deaths were a devastating loss, not only to their families, but to the entire military aviation community. The recovery of the bodies was a complex and dangerous operation. The crash site was located in extremely rugged terrain, accessible only by helicopter in good weather conditions. The same storms that had caused the crash continued to plague the area, making recovery efforts hazardous for the rescue teams. Dean Martin's reaction to the confirmation of his son's death was heartbreaking to witness. Friends and family members described him as completely broken by the loss. The man who had spent his career making people laugh and forget their troubles was now consumed by a grief so profound that it seemed to age him years in a matter of days. The funeral service for Dean Paul Martin Jr. was held at the Westwood Village Memorial Park Cemetery in Los Angeles. It was a military funeral, with full honors befitting a fallen officer. Fighter jets from Dean Paul's unit performed a missing man formation flyover, a traditional tribute to fallen aviators that brought tears to the eyes of everyone in attendance. The service was attended by hundreds of people, including many of Hollywood's biggest names. Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., Jerry Lewis, Lucille Ball, and Desi Arnaz Jr. were among the mourners who came to pay their respects. The presence of so many celebrities was a testament to the high regard in which Dean Paul was held throughout the entertainment industry. But perhaps the most poignant moment of the funeral came when Dean Martin, supported by his friends and family, approached his son's flag-draped coffin. The usually composed entertainer broke down completely, his grief so overwhelming that he had to be helped away from the gravesite. It was a moment that those present would never forget, the sight of one of America's most beloved entertainers brought to his knees by the loss of his child. Jane Martin, dressed in black and wearing a veil, stood beside her former husband throughout the service. Their shared grief temporarily bridged the gap that had developed between them during their divorce. In their moment of ultimate loss, they were united once again as parents mourning their child. The investigation into the crash would continue for months, with military officials conducting a thorough review of all factors that contributed to the accident. The final report would conclude that pilot error, caused by spatial disorientation in severe weather conditions, was the primary cause of the crash. No mechanical failures were found, and both pilots were cleared of any procedural violations. But for Dean Martin, the technical explanations meant nothing. His son was gone, killed in pursuit of a dream that had always worried his father. The guilt that Dean felt over not trying harder to dissuade Dean Paul from military aviation would haunt him for the rest of his life. The crash of Dean Paul Martin Jr.'s F-4C Phantom on March 21, 1987, marked the beginning of the end for the Martin family. The golden boy, who had seemed destined for greatness in multiple fields, had been cut down at the height of his powers, leaving behind a legacy of unfulfilled potential and a family destroyed by grief. The Dean Martin who emerged from his son's funeral was a fundamentally different man from the charismatic entertainer who had captivated audiences for decades. Friends and colleagues who had known him for years were shocked by the transformation. The quick wit, the easy smile, and the effortless charm that had defined his public persona seemed to have died with Dean Paul on that mountainside in the San Bernardino range. In the weeks following the funeral, Dean withdrew from public life almost completely. He cancelled scheduled performances, declined interview requests, and avoided the Hollywood social scene that had once been his natural habitat. The Rat Pack, that legendary group of entertainers who had ruled Las Vegas and Hollywood for so many years, found themselves without their most beloved member. Frank Sinatra, Dean's closest friend and frequent performing partner, tried desperately to draw him back into the world of entertainment. He offered Dean opportunities to perform, travel, and engage with the activities that had once brought him joy. But Dean's responses were polite but firm refusals. The fire that had once burned so brightly within him seemed to have been extinguished forever. Those who managed to spend time with Dean during this period described him as a ghost of his former self. He would sit for hours in his Beverly Hills home, staring out at the city that had made him famous, seemingly lost in memories of his son. The easy laughter that had once filled his home was replaced by a silence that was almost oppressive. Dean's drinking, which had long been part of his public image and private life, became more serious and problematic. What had once been the casual cocktails of a sophisticated entertainer became the desperate self-medication of a man trying to numb unbearable pain. Friends worried about his health, but their concerns were met with indifference or anger. The physical toll of his grief was immediately apparent. Dean, who had always been meticulous about his appearance, began to look haggard and unkempt. His famous silver hair became disheveled, his clothes hung loosely on his shrinking frame, and his eyes, once bright with mischief and intelligence, became dull and distant. His remaining children, Richie and Gina, tried to maintain connections with their father, but Dean's emotional unavailability made meaningful relationships difficult. He loved them deeply, but his grief over Dean Paul's death seemed to have consumed his capacity for expressing that love. The children found themselves dealing not only with their own grief over their brother's death, but also with the effective loss of their father to depression and despair. Jean Martin, despite their divorce, remained concerned about Dean's well-being. She would call regularly to check on him and occasionally visit to ensure he was taking care of himself. Their shared grief over Dean Paul's death had created a bond between them that transcended the issues that had led to their divorce. In many ways, they were able to provide each other with an understanding that no one else could offer. Dean's health began to deteriorate rapidly. The combination of excessive drinking, poor nutrition, and the stress of his grief began to manifest in serious physical symptoms. He developed emphysema, a condition that made breathing difficult and sapped his energy. The voice that had once been his fortune became raspy and weak, making even casual conversation an effort. Medical professionals who examined Dean during this period found a man who seemed to have lost the will to live. His emphysema was serious but treatable, but Dean showed little interest in following medical advice or making the lifestyle changes that might have improved his condition. He seemed to view his declining health as an inevitable consequence of his grief, something to be endured rather than fought. The entertainment industry watched Dean's decline with sadness and concern. Tributes and honors were offered, but Dean declined them all. He seemed to have no interest in celebrating his past achievements or receiving recognition for his contributions to American culture. The man who had once thrived on applause and adoration now seemed to find such attention burdensome. By the early 1990s, Dean had become almost completely reclusive. He rarely left his home, saw few visitors, and seemed to exist in a world of memories and regret. The vibrant social life that had once characterized his existence had been replaced by a solitary routine that revolved around his grief and his failing health. His former Rat Pack colleagues made repeated attempts to reconnect with him, but their efforts were largely unsuccessful. Dean would occasionally take their phone calls, but the conversations were brief and strained. The easy camaraderie that had once defined their relationships had been replaced by Dean's overwhelming sadness and his friend's helplessness in the face of his grief. Frank Sinatra, in particular, was deeply affected by Dean's withdrawal. The two men had been like brothers, sharing countless adventures and supporting each other through various personal and professional challenges. To see Dean reduced to such a state was almost unbearable for Sinatra, who later admitted that he felt he had lost his best friend long before Dean actually died. As Dean's health continued to deteriorate, his family began to prepare for the inevitable. His emphysema was making breathing increasingly difficult, and his overall physical condition was declining rapidly. Medical professionals warned that his refusal to follow treatment protocols and his continued drinking were accelerating his decline. On Christmas morning, 1995, Dean Martin died at his Beverly Hills home. He was 78 years old, and the official cause of death was acute respiratory failure secondary to emphysema. But those who knew him understood that he had really died 8 years earlier, on that March morning when his son's plane disappeared into the clouds over the San Bernardino Mountains. The news of Dean's death was met with an outpouring of grief from fans around the world. Tributes poured in from fellow entertainers, politicians, and ordinary people whose lives had been touched by his music and his performances. The man who had once been known as the King of Cool was remembered as one of the most beloved entertainers of his generation. His funeral was held at the Westwood Village Memorial Park Cemetery, the same location where his son had been laid to rest 8 years earlier. The service was attended by hundreds of people, including many of the biggest names in Hollywood. But perhaps the most moving tribute came from Frank Sinatra, who delivered a eulogy that captured the essence of their friendship and the magnitude of the loss. Jean Martin, now 68 years old, attended the funeral as the grieving mother of Dean's children and the woman who had shared his life during his happiest years. She had remained devoted to his memory throughout their separation and divorce, and his death left her feeling as though she had lost not just a former husband, but a fundamental part of her own identity. Dean Martin was buried next to his son Dean Paul, a fitting final reunion for a father and son whose relationship had been defined by love, pride, and ultimately tragedy. The headstone bore simple inscriptions that spoke to their shared legacy and the bonds that had connected them in life and death. The entertainment world had lost one of its greatest talents, but more importantly, a family had lost its patriarch. Dean's death marked the end of an era, not just in Hollywood but in the Martin family itself. The man who had once represented the pinnacle of American entertainment success had been brought down by the most fundamental human experience, the loss of a child. 21 years after Dean Martin's death, the Martin family faced another devastating blow that would complete the circle of tragedy that had begun with Dean Paul's plane crash. The year 2016 would prove to be particularly cruel to the surviving members of the family, delivering losses that seemed almost too painful to bear. Ricky Martin, Dean and Jean's youngest son, had spent his life trying to honor his father's memory while establishing his own identity. Born in 1953, Ricky had grown up in the shadow of his father's fame and his older brother's tragic death. He had pursued a career in music, releasing several albums and performing in venues around the world, but he had never achieved the level of success that had made his father a legend. Throughout his life, Ricky had struggled with the weight of being a Martin. The expectations, the comparisons, and the constant scrutiny had taken their toll on his personal relationships and his professional aspirations. He had married and divorced multiple times, and his attempts to build a stable family life had been complicated by the complex legacy of his famous surname. By 2016, Richie was 62 years old and living in Utah, far from the Hollywood spotlight that had defined his childhood. He had chosen a quieter life, focusing on his music and trying to find peace away from the entertainment industry that had brought his family so much joy and so much pain. On August 1, 2016, Richie Martin was found dead in his Utah home. The circumstances surrounding his death were mysterious, with no immediate explanation for what had caused the 62-year-old man to die suddenly. The official cause of death was not immediately determined, leaving his family and friends to grapple with another unexplained loss. The news of Richie's death was devastating to his mother, Jean, who was already battling her own serious health issues. At 89 years old, she had been diagnosed with cancer and was undergoing treatment that was proving to be both physically and emotionally exhausting. The loss of another child was almost more than she could bear. Jean Martin had spent the years since Dean's death trying to maintain connections with her surviving children, while preserving the memory of her former husband and her lost son. She had remained active in various charitable organizations and had occasionally given interviews about her life with Dean and the challenges of raising children in the spotlight of Hollywood fame. Despite her divorce from Dean, Jane had never remarried. She had remained devoted to the memory of their relationship and the family they had created together. Her identity was fundamentally tied to her role as Dean Martin's wife and the mother of his children, and she had never found a way to completely separate herself from that legacy. The cancer that was ravaging Jean's body was aggressive and unforgiving. At her age, treatment options were limited, and her doctors had been honest about the prognosis. She was facing her own mortality with the same grace and dignity that had characterized her entire life. But the loss of Richie made her final weeks even more difficult. Just 3 weeks after Ricky's death, on August 24, 2016, Jean Martin succumbed to her cancer. She died at her home in Beverly Hills, surrounded by family and friends who had been providing support during her final illness. She was 89 years old, and her death marked the end of an era for the Martin family. The timing of the two deaths was particularly cruel. Jen had barely begun to process her grief over Richie's death when she was overcome by her own illness. Those who were with her during her final weeks described her as being overwhelmed by the combination of physical pain and emotional devastation. The loss of both Richie and John within such a short period created a sense of cursed fate that seemed to surround the Martin family. 3 of the 5 members of the immediate family had now died, leaving only Gina Martin to carry on the family legacy. The pattern of loss that had begun with Dean Paul's plane crash seemed to have an inexorable momentum that no one could stop. Gina Martin, the only surviving child of Dean and Jean, was left to deal with the practical and emotional aftermath of losing both her brother and her mother in such rapid succession. She had already lived through the deaths of her brother Dean Paul and her father Dean, and now she was facing the reality of being the sole survivor of a family that had once been the embodiment of American entertainment success. The funerals for both Richie and Jean were private affairs, attended by family and close friends. The media attention was respectful but intense, with journalists and photographers documenting the final chapter of one of Hollywood's most famous families. The contrast between the glamorous public image of the Martin family and the private grief of their final years was stark and poignant. Jean's obituaries recalled her life as a model, a Hollywood wife, and a devoted mother. But those who knew her best remembered her as a woman who had maintained her dignity and grace through decades of triumph and tragedy. She had been the steady presence in a family that had experienced extreme highs and devastating lows, and her death represented the loss of the family's emotional center. The final irony of Jean's death was that it occurred in the same Beverly Hills home where she had once entertained the biggest names in Hollywood alongside her husband. The house that had once been filled with laughter, music, and the sound of Dean's voice was now silent, its rooms echoing with memories of a family that had been destroyed by a series of tragedies. In her final weeks, Jean had spoken to friends about her belief that she would be reunited with Dean and Dean Paul after her death. She had maintained her faith throughout her life, and the prospect of seeing her loved ones again seemed to provide her with comfort during her final illness. Those who were with her described her as being at peace, despite the physical pain she was experiencing. The deaths of Ricky and Jean in 2016 marked the effective end of the Martin family, as it had existed during Dean's lifetime. The Golden family that had once represented the pinnacle of American entertainment success had been reduced to a single surviving member, leaving behind a legacy that was defined as much by tragedy as by triumph. The pattern of loss that had begun with Dean Paul's plane crash 30 years earlier had finally reached its conclusion. The family that had once seemed blessed with talent, success, and happiness had been systematically destroyed by a series of deaths that seemed almost too cruel to be random. The American dream that the Martins had embodied had become an American nightmare, a cautionary tale about the price of fame and the fragility of human happiness. The Martin family's journey from the heights of Hollywood glamour to the depths of personal tragedy represents one of the most heartbreaking stories in American entertainment history. What began as a fairy tale romance between a rising star and a beautiful model evolved into a multi-generational saga of loss, grief, and the ultimate fragility of human happiness. Looking back at the arc of their lives, it becomes clear that the very qualities that made the Martin family so successful, their talent, their ambition, their willingness to take risks, also contributed to their ultimate downfall. Dean Paul's drive to excel at everything he attempted led him to the military aviation career that would cost him his life. Dean's passionate commitment to his craft created the emotional intensity that made him such a compelling performer, but also left him vulnerable to devastating grief when tragedy struck. The pattern of loss that defined the Martin family's later years was not unique to them, but the intensity and relentlessness of their tragedies was remarkable. The death of Dean Paul in 1987 set in motion a chain of events that would eventually claim the lives of all the family's principal members. Each loss seemed to make the survivors more vulnerable to the next tragedy, creating a downward spiral that no one could stop. Dean Martin's transformation from beloved entertainer to broken-hearted recluse illustrates the profound impact that the loss of a child can have on a parent. The man who had once made millions of people laugh and forget their troubles was himself unable to find any relief from his grief. His decline and death represented not just the end of a legendary career, but the completion of a tragedy that had begun with a phone call about a missing airplane. Jean Martin's life and death embodied the complexities of being connected to fame without being famous oneself. She had sacrificed her own career and identity to support Dean's success, and when their marriage ended, she found herself defined primarily by her relationship to him. Even after their divorce, she remained emotionally connected to Dean and their shared history, making her vulnerable to the same patterns of loss that had destroyed him. The deaths of Richie and John in 2016 served as a final, cruel punctuation mark to the Martin family's story. The timing of their deaths, just 3 weeks apart, seemed almost impossibly tragic, as if fate was determined to ensure that no member of the family would be spared from suffering. For Gina Martin, the sole survivor of her immediate family, the weight of carrying on the Martin legacy must be overwhelming. She has witnessed the destruction of her family over the course of 3 decades, watching as death claimed her brother, her father, her mother, and her remaining brother. The psychological impact of such losses is difficult to imagine, and her survival represents a kind of quiet heroism in the face of unimaginable grief. The Martin family's story serves as a powerful reminder that fame and success provide no protection against the fundamental tragedies of human existence. Death, grief, and loss are universal experiences that affect the famous and the unknown with equal force. The same media attention that celebrated the Martin family's successes also documented their tragedies, creating a public record of private pain that added an additional layer of suffering to their experiences. The entertainment industry's response to the Martin family's tragedies was generally respectful and supportive, but it also highlighted the ways in which celebrity can complicate the grieving process. The public's fascination with the private lives of famous people meant that each death was subject to extensive media coverage, preventing the surviving family members from processing their grief in private. Perhaps most significantly, the Martin family's story illustrates the importance of human connections and the devastating impact that their loss can have. Dean and Jean's divorce may have ended their marriage, but it could not sever the bonds that had been created through their shared experiences and their children. Their reunion in grief after Dean Paul's death demonstrated that some connections transcend legal and personal difficulties. The legacy of the Martin family is complex and multifaceted. They will be remembered for Dean's contributions to American entertainment, for the joy and laughter he brought to millions of people, and for the sophisticated elegance that characterized their public lives. But they will also be remembered for the tragedies that befell them, and for the way in which their private pain became a public story. The Martin family's experience offers no easy lessons or simple morals. Their story is not a cautionary tale about the dangers of fame or a redemptive narrative about overcoming adversity. Instead, it is a deeply human story about love, loss, and the ways in which tragedy can reshape and ultimately destroy even the most successful and talented families. In the end, the Martin family's story is a reminder that behind every public figure is a private person with the same vulnerabilities and capacity for suffering as anyone else. Their fame may have amplified their experiences and made their tragedies more visible, but it did not make them any less real or any less painful. The silence that now surrounds the Martin family name is perhaps the most fitting tribute to their memory. After decades of public attention, both celebratory and tragic, they have finally found the peace that eluded them in life. Their story stands as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the ultimate power of love to transcend even the most devastating losses. For those who remember Dean Martin's music, his movies, and his performances, the knowledge of his family's tragedies adds a poignant depth to his artistic legacy. The joy he brought to others was achieved at tremendous personal cost, and his ability to make people laugh and forget their troubles becomes even more remarkable when viewed against the backdrop of his own suffering. The Martin family's story continues to resonate because it speaks to fundamental human experiences: the love between parents and children, the bonds of marriage, the pain of loss, and the struggle to find meaning in the face of tragedy. Their fame may have made their story more visible, but their humanity makes it universally relevant. As we reflect on the Martin family's journey from triumph to tragedy, we are reminded that every life contains the potential for both great joy and profound sorrow. Their story serves as a powerful reminder to cherish the moments of happiness and connection that we experience, because we never know when they might be taken away. The Martin family's legacy lives on, not just in Dean's recordings and films, but in the memory of a family that loved deeply, suffered greatly, and ultimately found their way to a peace that had eluded them for so long. Their story is a testament to the enduring power of human connection and the ultimate triumph of love over loss. If you found this tragic tale as heartbreaking as we did, make sure to subscribe to Criminal Mind Cortex for more incredible true crime stories that reveal the hidden pain behind public success. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest investigations into the cases that remind us that fame and fortune cannot shield us from life's most devastating blows.